Good afternoon. Hopefully we are live, barring technical difficulties. If it's just me and Safe, it's going to be a different kind of webinar. So thank you for joining this CSET webinar on forecasting US-China coupling slash decoupling in the semiconductor industry. My name is Michael Page. I'm a CSET research fellow and the lead investigator of Fortel, CSET's pilot crowd forecasting project. Our featured speaker today is CSET research fellow Safe Khan. We'll hear from Safe in a moment, but first some housekeeping. All attendees' microphones are muted, and if you're joining by computer, we can't see you. If you have a question, please type it in the chat. We'll reserve the last 20 minutes for questions. Those who are phoning in for this meeting will not be able to ask questions, and we thank you for understanding the technical limitations here. Safe is a research fellow at CSET, a colleague of mine, focusing on AI policy, semiconductor supply chains, China's semiconductor industry, and US policy. Safe also has a decade of experience as an intellectual property and technology lawyer, including at Hewlett-Packard. With Fortel, we aim to take a big picture issue relevant to tech security policy, and then break it down into smaller forecastable chunks. Because the process of breaking down issues should be expert driven, we want to work with an expert on every cluster of questions. Safe is the expert that designed the most relevant cluster of questions relating to the future of US-China coupling slash decoupling in the semiconductor industry. Before we get into the substance, I should caveat that this cluster of questions is still new, and so all the data here is preliminary, but hopefully it's illustrative of the process. So let's begin with a teaser slide. Basically, we're going to spend the next half an hour talking about what this diagram means, and why policymakers should want a whole lot more of them. So with that teaser, let's move on to some place setting. So Safe, why should we care about semiconductors, and why are you focusing on semiconductor policy?
Yeah, so why do semiconductors matter? Yeah, so semiconductor chips, they're really just the linchpin of the economy and like technology supply chains as a whole, just hugely important. When you really look at the last several decades of economic and technical progress, a lot of that is based upon the IT revolution, but at the end of the day, a lot of that is essentially driven by computer chips or semiconductor chips getting better. So all of the things that we see kind of like getting better and better in recent years, whether it's like artificial intelligence, things like broadband, the internet, what have you. There's a lot of innovations in that level, but kind of behind the scenes, and I think sometimes underappreciated, is just that we're getting better and better chips, and that's because of the semiconductor industry. And yeah, that just makes it hugely important. I think a lot of people might have heard of Moore's Law. It's basically this observation that computer chips include double the number of transistors, these tiny computational elements, every 2 years, to the point where we now have billions of transistors in a single chip, making them really powerful. And so, yeah, it's really been a driver of progress. And then also, it's just like a really complex industry and just really interesting. I encourage you to go look up a video of what's called an extreme ultraviolet lithography tool in operation. You can go look it up on YouTube. And when you see that technology, you're like, okay, we're now living in the future. So, but yeah, then how did I end up working in policy? I just think it's a really important area given the technology centrality to the economy and just everything really. But it's really ultimately a very dual use technology. So we want to make sure that policy ensures that this tech is really used for good, whether it's scientific innovation. We had a great example of that last week where DeepMind, a sister company to Google, developed an artificial intelligence algorithm called AlphaFold, which solved a longstanding problem in protein folding, which is basically predicting the structure of proteins. And that was really only enabled because we have the advanced chips that are able to do the calculations for that algorithm. Then just generally underpinning economic growth and well-being. But on the other hand, chips are also used for all sorts of dangerous military systems that could proliferate or get in the wrong hands or be used in ways that violate civil liberties, such as really aggressive surveillance systems. And we also have to be careful about some other risks that come from using these chip-enabled technologies. For example, races to the bottom that compromise safety in advanced systems, such as in artificial intelligence. So, yeah.
What can policymakers do to influence the semiconductor industry, and what are they generally trying to achieve? I mean, what is the context in which policymakers in the tech security context care about this topic?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot of different policy levers available to like influence the semiconductor industry. Whether it's R&D funding, that's like a huge lever. Immigration and like workforce investment to make sure that we continue to develop this industry. And then also making sure that like we have the right amount of like production capacity that we need to service our demand. This is where efforts to pass incentives to keep semiconductor production in the United States come into play. Other governments, especially the Chinese government, have their own incentives and subsidies that are going into their industry. But then there's also trade policy to ensure that the chips get in the right place, I guess you could say, whether that's import restrictions and export controls are commonly used policy levers.
Right. And so, the title of this webinar is U.S.-China D/coupling. What are the considerations on what technologies China has access to in this context? And I'm referencing specifically the chip semiconductor manufacturing equipment breakdown. So why those two components here?
Sure. And before getting into that specifically, I'll just kind of like mention this graphic, which has kind of been up for a while I've been talking about something else. It's essentially a depiction of the chip supply chain, how chips are produced. At the left, you have R&D, which kind of feeds into the whole ecosystem. On the top, you have chip production, which is basically three stages. It's the design of the chip, then the manufacturing of the chip, and then finally, once it's manufactured, you have to assemble it, test it, and package it. And then finally, it'll go into a further stage of packaging to get into the final end device, such as a smartphone or a laptop or a car. But throughout this whole process, there's a whole number of other inputs that go into these production steps. So you see them, those three below. There's the design software and the IP, the equipment. It's called semiconductor manufacturing equipment in the industry, and then a number of advanced materials and chemicals. But yeah, Michael, as you noted, we're kind of really focused in this scenario on a couple of these sectors. So one of them is semiconductor manufacturing equipment on the bottom. So that's basically equipment that you have companies in the United States, Japan, and the Netherlands who produce over 90% of this equipment by market share. China has about 2% of global market share and doesn't really produce some of the most advanced equipment in this space. And this equipment ultimately is bought by chip makers who run chip manufacturing facilities. So that's in the manufacturing step up there. So this is where the world leaders are the United States, Taiwan, and South Korea, but a number of additional countries are involved in this space as well. This is an area where China is doing relatively better. They have something in the range of 15% of manufacturing capacity today. Under the status quo, it's expected that this is going to continue to grow to as much as like a quarter of capacity by the end of the decade. But that said, China still does not have capacity much for the most advanced chips.
Great. So that's all useful context for the next slide, which is the 2x2 scenario that SAFE designed. And so the context here is I strong-armed SAFE into coming up with a couple big picture, simple scenarios that describe different ways in which the semiconductor industry landscape might develop, focusing specifically on the level of integration between China and the US and its allies. And SAFE selected these two variables, these two predictors, and they are the two red boxes from the previous slide, chips and semiconductor manufacturing equipment. So SAFE, tell us about this diagram. Why these two variables, and what's the deal with these four scenarios you've sketched out?
Sure. So why these two variables? So as shown in the previous slide, those are kind of like two really important segments in the semiconductor industry. And then also two areas where China is fairly reliant on imports, especially in the equipment, but also, I mean, actually a huge degree in chips as well, even though they have a little bit more capacity in that case. And so that naturally leads to the question, especially given potential changes to trade policy, what degree of access China will continue to have in the coming years. And so, yeah, one of them is basically what is their access to foreign chips? And then the other one is what is their access to foreign semiconductor manufacturing equipment? And then so we plotted these on 2 axes here, and then depending on the variation that we see for each of those variables, we can kind of pluck like a particular scenario in different spots. So we divided it up here into 4 scenarios. One thing to keep in mind here, these are like highly stylized scenarios, and I'm going to describe some like specific things that happen in them. But there's like a huge amount of variation. You could like really break this down into 100 scenarios if you really wanted to. And so it's not necessarily going to be a perfect representation of like what exactly could happen. And then also while talking about it, I'll talk about how, a particular set of policy levers, particularly in this case, we're going to focus on export controls, how they could instigate one of these scenarios. And then also like the new policy options that become available once you end up in one of these scenarios as the year passes. So starting out with scenario 1, I would argue this is probably a little bit closer to of all of these scenarios to the one that we're actually in today. So in this scenario, China is able to import a significant amount of semiconductor manufacturing equipment, and with some exceptions, is able to import quite many of the most advanced chips. And currently, China imports about $300 billion of chips, actually. So it's actually their largest import. So yeah, in this scenario, China continues over the years to import chips in large quantities to meet their demand, which is quite big. But at the same time, they import large amounts of the equipment to build their chip making industry. And actually, in like the recent stats show that they're actually importing and consuming more of this equipment than just about anyone else, even though they don't actually have like the most capacity. So that really indicates the scale of their indigenization drive. As I mentioned before, if we consider this kind of like the existing policy under the scenario, we would expect China's share of global chip making capacity to slowly increase. And ultimately what this means is that the Chinese market could slowly wean itself off of some of the foreign chips that it imports. And so what this means is over time, the United States and its allies could eventually lose some leverage over Chinese access to chips. For example, the United States and some allies do apply export controls right now to the Chinese military. And as long as China cannot indigenously produce these chips, these export controls have some chance of being effective. But obviously, if China indigenizes, some of that leverage goes away. One thing to keep in mind, a big caveat though, even with imports of this equipment, Chinese chip makers, although they're likely to be able to expand their overall capacity considerably, at least for the most advanced capacity that makes the best chips, that's a really hard market to break into, and they've struggled with that. And it's unlikely in the near term that they're going to be able to accomplish this. And so in this scenario, one example policy response, and it's actually something that's kind of in the news today in the National Defense Authorization Act, the NDAA of 2021, which is just passing through Congress. It includes incentives to semiconductor manufacturers to build fabs in the United States. So essentially, the United States is seeing this erosion of chip making capacity, and China is gaining share. And so this is like a policy option that in this world is actually kind of currently being passed, but can continue to be considered over time. So moving to scenario 2, this is a case where, moving to the left, the US and its allies don't impose stricter controls on the chips, but do expand controls on the equipment. In this case, with reduced access to this foreign equipment, which is dominated by the US, Japan, and the Netherlands, you would expect that China's equipment industry, which right now has only about 2% of market share, it's going to kind of struggle to fill that gap in the near term or even in the medium term, as it's like relatively undeveloped. And it's really tough industry to break into. And so as a result, China's chip making industry, as far as its like ability to build new advanced chip fabs or kind of take increasing global share of capacity, that ability declines. So that effort kind of stalls. So as a result, China will remain relatively more dependent on chip imports in the longer term relative to scenario 1. And this gives the United States and its allies more sustained leverage in the future. So one interesting dynamic here, I guess worth noting, just in the conversation about decoupling, sometimes we might talk about decoupling as this kind of binary thing, like either like more integration or less integration. But I think the interplay between these scenarios kind of suggests like kind of a more interesting granular dynamic. And so you can imagine that like on one axis, if you like couple really hard, then you could potentially decouple on another axis. And the same goes the other way. If you decouple on one axis, it could strengthen coupling on another axis. So kind of applying it to these scenarios in scenario one, essentially, if you're exporting the equipment, that ultimately means that China is going to be able to build up their chip making capacity, which ultimately gives them the option to at least somewhat decouple in chips in the longer term. And then scenario two is kind of the opposite of this. If you have some kind of effort in decoupling on the equipment, then what that means is China becomes more dependent on the chips and has more difficulty decoupling on that axis. So that's something I really found interesting in comparing those two scenarios. Running really quick through the last couple of scenarios. In scenario three, this is where the United States and its allies limit exports on the equipment, but expand export controls on the chips. In this case, without access to the advanced chips, China suffers real setbacks in its economic, technological, and military ambitions. But China kind of is spurred to add even greater subsidies to its chip making industry to really, really quickly indigenize so that it is able to like get back that access domestically. Obviously, they have huge subsidies already, but it would just become an even bigger priority. These efforts will struggle in the near term, but eventually, they'll build up capacity. And at the same time, some of the US chip companies who really rely on revenue from the Chinese market will kind of lose a little bit of their technological edge, which makes it a little bit easier for Chinese chip makers to catch up. And so ultimately, at the end of the day, you would expect that US and allied leverage over China over chips decreases. In scenario four, this is a case where essentially the United States and its allies expand export controls on both the equipment and the chips. Similar to the scenario three, you'll see kind of real effects on China's economic, technological, and military abilities. But then at the same time, without access to the equipment, China's going to actually have a lot of difficulty in building up an advanced chip making industry because they'll have to indigenize the equipment at the same time. Ultimately, what this means is that you could see global supply chains kind of split into two, especially at the advanced level, where China has its own indigenous supply chain, which is going to really struggle to get to an advanced level than the rest of the world's supply chain. But because the industry really relies on global integrated markets where companies are able to exploit the economies of scale that really you get when you have access to global markets, you'll probably see in the industry as a whole slowing innovation, which will have downstream effects on the development of other advanced tech that depends on these chips. So yeah, that's kind of a big summary of that, of all the scenarios, and I'll stop there for now. Yeah.
That was great. So it's our collective goal is to forecast where we are. Well, I guess we're not forecasting where we are, but to assess where we are and forecast where we're going. The problem that we have here, that we have everywhere, is that we can't directly forecast these scenarios because they're vague descriptions of a landscape several years from now. So what we have done is we have operationalized these scenarios by turning them into metrics. And by turning them into metrics, we can measure where we are, where we've been, and we can forecast where we're going. And we'll talk a bit about the metrics we selected and why. But I'll first note the metrics on the left are the forecast questions on Fortell, cset/fortell.com. There are two types of questions on Fortell. There are questions based on continuous historical variables, and then there are binary questions. So most of the examples here are in the former category, things like US exports of chips to China. An example of the latter would be the chance of new export controls on Chinese chip makers. We had a question along those lines that was published today. So what we really want to do is generally describe the landscape using primarily the questions based on continuous historical variables, and then forecast what would happen if the US enacted certain policies, or see what effect certain actions by China or the US has on the landscape as defined by those continuous historical variables. It's a bit abstract, but hopefully you'll see more clear examples of it momentarily. First, Saif, say a bit about why you selected these metrics.
Sure. So first, kind of at a higher level, like the reason, like the kind of the factors that go into the type of metrics that we pick. One of it is that just that there's available data. A lot of the metrics that we would ideally want, we just don't have data that can be easily tracked over time. Another one is obviously just like what correlates with best with these predictors. So the predictors on the right, which of these metrics on the left correlate best? One other initial note that I would make, these are like highly imperfect metrics. And I'm sure some listeners here will like immediately recognize some flaws. Yeah, I mean, these are just like an initial stab at it. So like one thing that we're really keen on is if like anyone has any ideas for even better metrics than these, the good thing about like the Fortel platform is that like we could just take those metrics and like add new questions and then better measure the predictors on the right side. But at least the ones that we picked so far, just in our initial attempt, and I'll look specifically at the bottom predictor for equipment. The first two there are US exports to China, and then another one is Chinese imports. So this is basically just trade data. And we separated out these two different items because Chinese imports, that just kind of gives you the total scale of the imports as a whole. But then the other metric, US exports, just like carves out the US contribution to that. So with the combination of these metrics, you can kind of have a sense of whether the US is going at it alone in terms of like implementing certain trade policies, or if the United States and its allies are collaborating. So you would have like very different effects. And the scenarios I described earlier, you know, those were just 4 scenarios that didn't even get into that additional detail, which we thought about for a bit, but that would have expanded it to 9 scenarios. And like this would have gone on for like 3 hours. So we didn't do that. But yeah, that's another thing to think about. Another one is percentage of top SME companies revenue from China. That one has the advantage of kind of normalizing for the size of the market, because you could imagine that the other 2 metrics, you know, the numbers decline, but then it actually was just because like the industry as a whole shrunk or something. But here, you know, this will kind of correct for whether China is like losing access relative to others. And so, you know, you might see a decline in the first 2 metrics, but the third one remains stable. So yeah, these are kind of like just like numerical metrics. You know, there's a couple drawbacks here. Like one of them is just that like these are the kind of things that like are already in market forecasts. So like we're not necessarily adding like a huge amount. I think we're definitely probably like adding something compared to like what you could just publicly find. But there are like, you know, there's plenty of industry analysts and companies who are projecting these things. We also kind of want to like get some questions that nobody else is looking at. And that's where I'm kind of excited about then adding in other ones like this, which are like binary questions about like whether particular policies will pass. And the particular question that we added for equipment just today was asking whether there will be like new export controls applied to chip makers who are the consumers of equipment in China in the next year. And so we actually had a couple of months ago a question about SMIC, which is China's top chip maker, amid rumors that they were going to be added to the US entity list, which is a trade blacklist. And ultimately, actually, it turned out that this is actually an interesting case of like defining the question properly, which is a real challenge in like formulating this. And so we kind of like learned our lesson, which is there was instead like kind of a different legal tool that was used to apply export controls on SMIC. And so that technically caused the question to resolve no, when in fact like the spirit of it turned out to be yes. So for the newer question, we made sure to take into account like broader possibilities.
Yes.
Yeah.
For those of you who are frustrated by the resolution of the SMIC question, hopefully you'll be happier with the crafting of the new question. We're learning as we go. All right, let's talk a bit about Fortel methodology, and then we'll look at some of the actual data that we have so far. To understand what we do, let's take an historical example. So pretend it's 2017. And we are looking here at data on Chinese chip imports. So our goal is to forecast what will happen with this metric in 2018. So the blue line here is historical data. We can see it's generally increasing over time. We see a spike in 2013. The dashed red line is a projection based entirely on historical data. And I'm using here the default projection function in Excel, which is the AAA ETS exponential smoothing algorithm. Details don't really matter. Linear regression works basically the same way. The dotted red line is the 90% confidence interval for that projection. So one way to think about this is focusing only on the historical data. This is what we should expect. We should expect this metric to follow the dashed red line. And the deviation from that dashed red line could be construed as our surprise based on historical data. What we want the crowd to do is forecast where this metric is going to go. And so you might say the crowd should just say, well, we'll trust the algorithm and forecast that this metric will follow the dashed red line. The problem is the algorithm knows nothing about what's happening in the world. So if you were forecasting today, you might take into account the effect the pandemic will have on a trend, or the effect that recent policy changes will have, or the election, basically anything happening on the front page of the New York Times. But those facts aren't reflected in the dashed red line. So what we want the crowd to do is take all that information that is not reflected in the dashed red line and use it to forecast where this trend will go. And then what we do is we measure the difference between what actually, or what the crowd thinks will happen, what actually happened, between what the crowd thinks will happen and what would be expected based on the historical data. And that's basically the surprise factor, the deviation from the historical trend. So I chose 2018 because there is a very large deviation, an anomalously large deviation, $47 billion. And so 2018 was a strange year for Chinese imports. And what we want to do is basically get a heads up when there's going to be a strange departure from the historical trend because there might be policy implications. The absolute deviation from the historical projection is going to be a function of qualities that are specific to a metric. So here for Chinese chip imports, we have hundreds of billions of dollars. We see a certain amount of variation that affects what that confidence interval size is. So we actually create a standard unit, which is the absolute distance between what the crowd forecasts or what happened and what was projected, divided by the 90% confidence interval. The details there don't really matter. The point is that allows us to compare the trend departure figure across different metrics. So let's look at what happened to each of the 5 metrics that SAFE selected in 2018 after we normalize it in that way. So here's what happened. The vertical axis is that normalized unit I was mentioning. The numbers at the top are the absolute amount that each of these metrics exceeded what we would expect based on historical data. And we can see that they all exceeded what we'd expect based on historical data by quite a lot. So there were significant trend departures across the board on these 5 metrics. So again, our challenge, what we're trying to do is get some advance notice on things like this. And so I'll pause there and ask you, Safe, if you were a policy analyst working on these topics in 2017, would you have found advance notice on these types of trend departures relevant to your work? And if so, how?
Yeah, definitely. So like my immediate thought when like looking at these numbers would be that China is kind of like increasing its efforts at like technology indigenization across the board, really. And one thing to note, which I didn't earlier, is that like obviously there's like sometimes like very different alternative interpretations of what these data mean. So like probably what I would be thinking of as a policy analyst with the equipment metrics, I would probably just be thinking they're trying to build up their chip making industry even faster than before. And so that explains that, because you don't use that equipment for very much else than just like operating chip fabs. But there's also obviously some role of like maybe they're like building some more of that equipment, and then you know, some equipment is getting shipped, and then there's some work done on that, and it's like reshipped. So there's like some kind of like alternative interpretations there. With the chips, it gets like especially complicated. On one hand, you might think that they're just kind of like expanding their consumption overall. But at the same time, China is also a place where a lot of packaging happens, both of like the chips themselves in the semiconductor process or in the semiconductor production process, but then also the packaging that goes into like making laptops or something. And so there could be some like interpretation there that says like a lot more packaging is happening in China. So you obviously have to like disentangle some of these different possibilities. Another possibility that comes up for this whole like set of metrics is I would think maybe amid like rising trade tensions in 2017, I would think maybe there's more of like a stockpiling effort in case of like future trade restrictions. But all of those possibilities are really interesting, and it kind of narrows down the space of like what I would be worrying about as a policy analyst at that time.
Great. And there are multiple ways to use this data, and I know we're going to talk about that in a moment. One way that one could use it is to describe what they want a policy to accomplish, and to try to get a prediction of whether the policy will in fact accomplish that. I don't know, Safe, could one describe the desired effect of putting SMIC on the entity list in terms of these metrics?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, if you did that, you would probably, at least in the near term, expect some changes in these metrics, particularly the ones on Chinese SME imports or US exports of SME to China. So yeah, there's kind of like a direct connection between the metric and that potential policy change. Yeah.
Is it fair to say that, I mean, I'm not in the weeds on these policy issues. Do policymakers or policy analysts disagree about the effect of putting a company on the entity list or otherwise imposing new export controls on that company?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's, for one, the way that the United States implemented that policy earlier this year was in a unilateral way. And so there's obviously disagreement about whether it will be highly effective if you have other US allies that are able to export similar equipment. So there's some disagreement there. There's also disagreement about what is the degree to which export controls could potentially just like incentivize China to like more quickly advance their more indigenous industry or their indigenous industry. And so the export controls ultimately backfire. So those are like ongoing like policy disagreements. And so, yeah, like one thing you might, yeah, like the combination of all of these metrics could hopefully let us figure out like which of these are right. And yeah, there's also like an interesting piece here, especially when you have like the combination of the metric of like kind of a binary policy decision being made. For example, that last question that we added today about like future export controls that are applied, and then you relate it to some of these metrics. Suppose that, forecasters are thinking that maybe there's like a 50% chance of like something happening, and then it happens and it's 100%. And at the same time, you see in these like numerical continuous metrics, some like dollar value that in imports or exports that drops. That would be kind of like a measurable effect by taking those two things together, but like what the policy is expected to accomplish. It might be the case that as a policymaker, before you saw this, you had a prediction about what the effect is going to be. And then so you can kind of like, hopefully if it works all how like we hope it'll work, that could potentially, hopefully immediately be, I guess, validated or falsified. And it's like a good learning opportunity for policymakers, which I'm like really in favor of more of. Like, let's make it empirical and let's make sure that we learn from our mistakes, because we're going to make lots of mistakes in this like hugely complicated space.
Yeah, I mean, obviously you're preaching to the choir here. I mean, independent of the crowd forecasting component, I would love it if policymakers cashed out their disagreement in terms of something measurable like this. So policymaker A says export control and SMIC will have X effect. Policymaker B says it will have Y effect. Let's measure that. Let's then see what happens a year or 2 years later so we can learn something. We can see who is right. And if we can ask the crowd who is right, and then we see over time that the crowd is reasonably accurate, well then great. We have a new policy tool that can help us identify which expert is more likely to be accurate about the effect of a policy. And that's the direction that we're headed. So those five, actually, I guess there are 6 metrics now that inform safe semiconductor scenarios that are live on Fortel. Here's one of them. This is the Chinese imports of chips metric that we were looking at earlier. So here we have actual data from Comtrade. you can see the 2018 spike we were just looking at. You can see 2019 went down a little bit. And now the data for 2020 is partial. We have some information on the site about what we see so far, but we don't have data for the entire year yet. And we're forecasting what will happen in 2021. And so this is a graph directly off of Foretell. I encourage you all to go read the question. There's a lot of background information, make a forecast. What we're doing now is we are doing exactly what we did for 2018, but instead of using actual data, we're using forecast data. And this is what we have. Now, this chart is a bit misleading because the y-axis is an order of magnitude smaller than the y-axis for 2018. So I think the best way to understand this is the crowd currently does not project much trend departure for 2021. These are pretty close to, we expect these metrics to proceed as we would expect based on the historical data. We see a little bit of an expectation that there will be an increase in China's access to foreign chips and a decrease in China's access to foreign SME. But I think time will tell whether these patterns persist. Saif, any reactions to the data so far?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, the data obviously don't like suggest some like tectonic shift in expectations. It is also interesting that like to the extent there's like some small effect here, it's in the direction of scenario 2, which is like the chip dependent scenario. But that said, like zooming out, like we didn't necessarily know that like the forecasters are going to just expect kind of a small trend departure. So the fact that they're projecting not a huge amount of change is actually itself like really interesting to know. And then also, it's not necessarily reflected in this data, but like you can dive in a more granular way into some of the data that like kind of gets aggregated into these like average forecasts. There could be really interesting hidden patterns. Like one that immediately comes to mind that would be quite interesting is, are these forecasts all generally like clustered around like similar numbers? Or is like there a huge amount of variance where people think that like actually there's a set of people who think this world is going to happen, and then there's another set of people who think this world is going to happen. That might suggest that they're kind of implicitly guessing that there's some big policy decision that's going to come, and you know, it's going to resolve in a binary way in one direction or the other, and that could be like really different worlds. But then, you know, when you take the averages of these, it just kind of shows like small trend departure. And so you can actually even like metricize this into something that kind of shows the volatility or variance in the forecast. And that itself would be something really interesting to track over time. You know, there's this index called VIX that's one of like the stock market indicators that kind of shows generally the volatility in the stock market as a whole. And when you look at it, when there's kind of a financial panic, suddenly it like goes up a lot. And like the analogous case here, you could like metricize something that kind of shows, okay, the policy world is now in chaos, something's going to happen. And you can kind of like tell when that's going to happen. So that would be an interesting other way to look at it. And
on that, I should note that Saif and I used to share an office before the pandemic forced us into our remote cubicles. And I recall when there was, I forget what the policy was, but there was some policy affecting semiconductors. And we were discussing what the relevance was. And I think you said, well, let's just look at the stock price of these companies and see what the market thinks the effect will be on those companies. And it's a great idea because you're basically using the wisdom of the crowd in a particular context to estimate the effect on these companies. Unfortunately, the stock market doesn't measure everything we care about for policy purposes. And so what we're trying to do is basically create something like a stock ticker for other dimensions relevant to the policy landscape. And so as Saif mentioned, we can think of this as a baseline set of forecasts. Ideally, we would have these in perpetuity, so long as you're interested in these scenarios. And you can see how they change over time. You can see how they change in response to events. You can see if they gradually develop, if the election had an effect on them. And you can use these as a baseline to make forecasts about the effect of a policy under consideration. Are there any policies on the horizon now, Safe, that you would be interested in having the crowd forecast conditionally?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I guess one I would have, which is kind of like happening already, is like whether the NDAA would pass with the semiconductor incentives. That one is kind of like resolving yes, but then also like the evolution of that. Um, Obviously, it's going to have to be implemented by the government. Will like the funds get effectively dispersed? How much will get dispersed? Like that's a thing that I would be really interested in seeing what the crowd thinks. Um, uh, Another one is simply some of the policies that we talked about here, right? Like trade policy, how does it change? What happens with export controls? What happens with tariffs? What happens with R&D? What happens with like STEM immigration? All of these things would be like really like interesting, and they would definitely impact some of the scenarios that we were talking about here.
Great. And we're going to open up to questions in about 2 minutes. So if you have any questions, go ahead and type them into the chat channel, and I'll read off several of them. Before I do that, another source of value here could be the rationales that forecasters provide. Say, is that something that you might look toward? I mean, if, for example, if the people who expected the metric to go in one direction were citing a different piece of evidence than the people who expected the metric to go in a different direction?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's always useful to look at some of the comments. Sometimes people come up with an unusual consideration, and it's also kind of like a self-correcting process, right? Because like one forecaster might have like maybe a rationale that isn't so great, but then somebody else comes up with like a really interesting consideration that then other people see and they adopt. And then so that really like that combination of all of the people putting in comments is really useful. At the end of the day, I think ultimately like the crowd forecast is really like the valuable part. I remember this like office exercise, Michael, that you did, where I think what were we doing? We were counting the beans in a jar or something like that. And like, I think you were starting out some of this project, and like, I think it all hinged on whether this would work out. Everybody in the room had to predict how many were actually in there. And it actually turned out that we had a lot of like variance in the numbers, but it was actually the crowd forecast that was like, actually turned out to be almost right on target. So
it was. So what I was trying to do was replicate, there's this kind of iconic forecasting story involving Sir Francis Galton in like 1916 at the county fair, where people were trying to guess the weight of an ox. And he observed that the mean or median forecast was basically spot on. And so I was trying to replicate that. And I was a little bit nervous it wouldn't work and that nobody would believe this methodology was useful. But sure enough, the most accurate forecast was in fact the mean of the group and not any individual, which is nice. And Safe has brought up a point about the distribution of these forecasts a couple times, which is really important. Ultimately, it's not just the point estimate we're looking toward, it's the distribution. So another thing we can look toward is maybe if there's going to be no trend departure for these metrics, we'd expect policy X to be a good idea. But if we were going to see a 2018 level trend departure, we would not want to pursue policy X. And so we want to know, what is the likelihood of that occurring? Well, we can estimate that based on the crowd forecast as well. So I was looking at the magnitude of trend departure in 2018 for Chinese imports of chips, and wondering what, according to the crowd, is the likelihood that we will see that in 2021. And right now it's about 9%. You can see when we look up here, that top bracket, I think is 380 billion. And the crowd currently says that there's a 9% chance of that occurring. And that is a similar trend departure to what we saw in 2018. So it's unlikely, but it's certainly not impossible. And if that would have massive policy implications, we should bear that in mind. Safe, let's go back to this first image. Why did you put us in that quadrant?
Yeah, I mean, it's really based on an extremely qualitative sense of where like the numbers are putting us right now. I mean, obviously you saw in like some of the charts that you showed that we've seen like an increase in the last couple of years in the total number of Chinese imports, and then also in US exports for some of these metrics. And so that kind of like makes me think that we're probably somewhere more in that quadrant, but ultimately it's rather subjective at the end of the day. Yeah.
And so we will continue to develop these scenarios, and we will probably add more metrics and possibly add conditional forecasts. And so if you have suggestions for how we can do that, please let us know. There are several ways in which you can submit those suggestions on Foretell. We're now going to open up for a few questions. I should also note that Saif has a blog post describing a lot of what he's discussing today, including why he selected these scenarios and how we are measuring them. That is available on the blog component of fortel.com. So I encourage you to check that out. Okay, let's take a look at some of these questions. One question we have is, could we use this tool to estimate the R&D hit to US companies of certain unilateral export controls to evaluate the potential decrease in the rate of innovation? So, Saif, if you wanted to measure, and this is really putting you on the spot, the effect on US R&D relevant to semiconductors, any metrics that jump out as being good candidates?
Yeah, I mean, actually, this is one that you could probably relatively easily put together a question, maybe even a conditional forecast. You know, you could have maybe a pair of questions that say conditional on this export policy being passed with all of these details that are mentioned in that question. It's unilateral or whatever. What is the R&D of these certain companies, which they publicly report in their financial statements? What's it going to look like in some period of time, 2021, 2022, whatever it is? And then you can have a complementary question that says, no, this policy was not passed. Then what will be the result in that case? So yeah, actually, that's actually like a really interesting idea where we can actually like metricize that pretty well, hopefully. I think there's obviously yeah, like a lot of different like variations of like the policy that gets passed that you could pick here, but I think there's ways to do it.
Great. One thing I like to do in general is for any given policy issue, we can think of different categories of things that feed into the ideal set of forecast questions. One is, what are the policy levers available? And so here we're talking primarily about unilateral export controls, but we can imagine other policy levers as well. Another is, what are the main outcomes of interest that we want policies to positively affect in one direction or another? And so that question got to a different outcome variable that we might care about, the effect on R&D. Another outcome, this is the one that we were implicitly talking about for much of the last hour, is China's indigenous capabilities. And so, another question here is about whether we can use this tool to forecast when China might achieve certain levels of capability, sensitive to whether the US imposes certain export controls. Do you have a sense of what, if we were to try to articulate milestones for, China's indigenous capabilities, what some candidates might be?
Yeah, sure. So one interesting one would be what kind of domestic chip making capacity do they have? So one thing that's nice about Moore's law and the progression of chips is that they all have these names which represent kind of the generation of the chip. And so the most advanced generation, it's called 5 nanometers. And that's those chips are currently only produced by a TSMC, a company in Taiwan, Samsung, a company in South Korea. China has SMIC, SMIC, which produces 14 nanometer chips, but with relatively low volume today. And so you could basically just say in a couple of years, maybe have a question that gives you buckets for like what will be the most advanced node, as they call it, or like process that they'll be at that given time, would say some like threshold level of capacity, because like maybe it doesn't count if you just have capacity that's like really minimal or experimental. And so yeah, you could absolutely project that. Sometimes it's a little bit tough to get like information on that capacity data, but I mean, I think this is something that you could work with. Yeah.
Great. Another question we had is about whether there's a risk of people kind of gaming the forecast to get more, to either to encourage people to pursue the policy outcome that they want. So I'll take that one. I'll say absolutely. It's possible that the crowd will be inaccurate. It's also possible the crowd will be inaccurate in a manipulative way. I think that's unlikely, because the more people you have, the harder it is to game a system like this. Fortunately, we have access to the data over time. So we'll be able to point to the results and the track record. And if we see signs that it's being gamed in some way, we can take precautions to mitigate those downside risks. Another question that's come up is how much, when you're looking at the different scenarios, like the 4 different scenarios you described at the beginning, um, how much do you think where we're headed is an effect of U.S. policy decisions versus an effect of exogenous variables that are impossible to directly influence?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. At the end of the day, we can't capture all like the entire universe of different factors that are driving us into these different worlds. And so, yeah, we're just going to have to do the best we can. Um, on that score, what I would just suggest is like, let's identify more metrics. Let's identify, like, I mean, obviously, like we're looking at trade policy in this case, but like maybe the key factor here is that we've made some big R&D breakthroughs that like enable us to do certain things that we weren't able to do. So the industry just gets bigger and we sell more chips. But if we think that's like a potential like real possibility, maybe that's something we should be tracking too. The more of these metrics that you kind of add to like capture some of like the most important like I guess like causal like features that cause these scenarios to come into the world, the better. Obviously, there's some limit. We don't want to make it too complicated, right? Like there's limited forecaster attention, and we want to focus on the things that are more important. But yeah, at the end of the day, that's like kind of one limitation in the approach. But I'm optimistic that we can like work around it.
What about time scale? On what, how, when you're thinking about the way the semiconductor landscape might develop, are you thinking in terms of 1 year out, 5 years out, 20 years out, and why? How do you think about what timeline to think about?
Yeah, so the industry, it's like a $500 billion industry. I like to imagine it like a super tanker that like you can kind of only like move like really slowly because these are like huge macro trends, right? And so on the longer time scale is I think where you'll really see like a lot of like key effects. I mean, you see there's like some of these projections by industry that suggest, China's chip making share will go from 15% to 24% over the next decade. I mean, that's a decade long, and maybe it's like a 1% change per year. And so I think a 1% change in a year is actually still really interesting. But at the same time, I mean, this is a macro trend that you want to track over the longer term. But that said, yeah, I mean, I think there's enough information here where you can track things in the near term and still get a lot of interesting information. But like, I'm really interested in seeing what happens in the future as well. I know on Fortel, we've talked about how like, so far we've like focused on questions that are just 18 months into the future, not more than that. I'm really fascinated about the possibility of including questions that kind of get into longer range forecasting. I know there's a lot of concerns over that of whether that will be effective. I'm like, actually, that's a question for you, Michael. Do you think that's something that like we could potentially do? What are the limitations in trying longer range forecasting?
Yeah, I would love to. I mean, so right now we are constrained in part by the evidence base for what works. So we know based on a lot of the work that has been done over the past 20 years by, famously by the IARPA-funded ACE project, but there's a big group of academics who've been showing the efficacy of crowd forecasting for a long time. And there's pretty good evidence that it's effective over about a year. And there's less evidence that's effective over much longer periods of time. And obviously that's going to vary by type of question. So we've been kind of artificially limiting ourselves to questions that will resolve in 12 to 18 months. Ideally, for these questions based on continuous historical variables, we would ask the crowd to forecast a number of different time horizons. So for example, for each of the metrics that we selected for your scenarios, we could have a 6-month out forecast, a 12 months out forecast, and an 18 months out forecast. And then you could just see how that is likely to, how the crowd predicts this metric will change over time. And if you want to discount the 18-month forecast by a little bit because the evidence base is weaker for it, you can. But it's fairly cheap for the crowd to provide that information, and is probably better than not having it for you. So we could go further out. We could have the crowd forecast where these metrics might be in 2 years or longer. And it could be that for metrics like the semiconductor metrics, that works better because it might be this is a slower moving landscape in which 4-year forecasts are more manageable than they would be in other contexts. Problem is we're not going to have evidence for the accuracy of 4-year forecasts for 4 years. And so we're not really in a position to tell policymakers they should take them seriously until then. So we could do it to try to bolster the evidence base, but the upside in the short term is going to be limited. Safe. So we're hoping that we have about 1 minute left. So I'll just ask you kind of a close-up question. Our objective is to have forecasts on metrics like this indefinitely. Is this something that you would look to, like you look to the stock market, if that were available to you?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so kind of going back on something I said earlier, policy initiates like a given scenario, but then a lot of like new policy options become available, and you want to constantly be seeing like how does policy evolve to create new policy options. So this is kind of like an iterative thing where you have to keep going and getting updates on what's happening. I think we talked a little bit earlier about like the value of the stock ticker approach. You see suddenly some change in probability and then how that affects in one metric, and then you see how that affects other metrics. So yeah, I mean, I think that's really valuable. Yeah,
Great.
I think it feeds into all of the other things that we said. Yeah.
Well, thank you for being a willing kind of pilot project guinea pig for Foretell. We really appreciate you being game. And thank you everyone for tuning in. Please register as a forecaster if you haven't already, and stay tuned. We hope to have a kind of more exciting announcements about where Foretell is going to go coming up.
All right, thank you.